Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most elaborate deceptions. A con game so masterful, so perfectly disguised, that it fooled entire civilizations for over 1,000 years. Picture this. What if I told you that every fairy tale ending you've ever believed in, every romantic royal wedding you've swooned over, was actually part of the greatest scam in human history? What if those beautiful princess gowns were really chains, and those golden crowns were actually price tags? Tonight, we're pulling back the velvet curtain on medieval royal marriages, and I promise you, what you're about to discover will change how you see every Disney movie forever. Now, before we dive into this royal rabbit hole together, I'd love it if you could hit that like button, but only if tonight's story truly captivates you. And hey, if you're someone who loves uncovering the hidden truths behind history's most beautiful lies, that subscribe button is calling your name. I'm genuinely curious. Are you listening to this tucked in bed? Maybe with a cup of tea? Or perhaps you're taking a late night walk under the stars? Drop a comment and let me know where this story finds you tonight. Your stories always make my day. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's step back in time together and... You know, we live in an age where we complain about dating apps. We swipe left, we swipe right, we ghost people after 3 dates. We think modern romance is complicated, don't we? But imagine if your parents could legally sell you to a complete stranger when you were still learning to walk. Imagine if your first kiss was scheduled by a diplomatic committee, and your wedding night was a public spectacle witnessed by dozens of strangers. Welcome to medieval royal marriage, where love was a luxury no one could afford, and every I do was really saying I surrender. Here's what they don't teach you in history class. Medieval royal marriages weren't romantic unions. They were business mergers. They weren't about finding your soulmate. They were about expanding your empire. And the bride? She wasn't a princess finding her prince. She was inventory being transferred from one warehouse to another. Let me paint you a picture that'll make your skin crawl. In 1160, a little girl named Margaret was born in Scotland. She was beautiful, they said. Sweet-natured. She probably loved playing with dolls, maybe chasing butterflies in the castle gardens. Normal kid stuff, right? But by the time Margaret turned 3 years old, she was already engaged to be married. Not to another child, mind you. To Henry, the young King of England, who was already a grown man planning military campaigns. 3 years old, and her entire future was sold and sealed with a handshake between 2 men who probably couldn't even pronounce her full name correctly. This wasn't unusual. This was Tuesday. See, here's the thing about medieval royal families. They didn't see their children as children. They saw them as assets. Living, breathing chess pieces in a game of political monopoly that spanned continents. Every royal baby born came with an invisible price tag hanging around their neck. And that price was calculated not in gold, but in strategic value. Think about it. If you're a medieval king, your daughter isn't your little princess who needs bedtime stories and scraped knee kisses. She's your most valuable trading card. She's a potential peace treaty with legs. She's your ticket to claim in someone else's kingdom, or your insurance policy against being invaded yourself. The cold, hard truth. Love was the enemy. Genuine affection between royal spouses was actually dangerous because it meant the couple might start making decisions based on their hearts instead of their kingdom's needs. And that, my friends, was a luxury medieval politics simply couldn't afford. I want you to imagine something for a moment. Imagine you're 8 years old, playing in your backyard, and suddenly your parents call you inside. Sweetie, they say, we've got wonderful news. You're getting married next month to someone you've never met, in a country you can't pronounce, where they speak a language you don't understand. Isn't that exciting? That was reality for royal children. except there was no next month. These engagements often happened in infancy, with the actual ceremonies taking place years later, sometimes decades. These kids grew up knowing their entire adult life had already been scripted by strangers, and they had no say in editing the plot. But here's where it gets really twisted. Medieval royal marriages weren't just arranged. They were performed with all the pageantry of a genuine love story. The white dress, the beautiful ceremony, the celebration afterwards. Everyone played along with the romantic fantasy because, well, it made the bitter pill of political manipulation so much easier to swallow. It was theatre. Pure, elaborate theatre designed to make a property transaction look like a fairy tale. And the most heartbreaking part? Many of these royal brides and grooms never even met their spouses until their wedding day. Can you imagine? Your first conversation with the person you're legally bound to spend your entire life with happens at the altar, probably in front of hundreds of strangers, while wearing the most uncomfortable outfit you've ever put on. Some couples were luckier. They might exchange a few letters beforehand, maybe a portrait. But even those portraits were basically medieval Photoshop. Court artists were hired to make everyone look like a Renaissance Instagram filter had blessed them from birth. One particularly brutal example, in 1396, 6-year-old Isabella of Valois was married to 29-year-old King Richard II of England. The age gap alone should make your stomach turn. But here's the kicker. This marriage was specifically designed to end a war between England and France. Little Isabella wasn't walking down the aisle to meet her Prince Charming. She was walking down the aisle to seal a ceasefire agreement. She was a living, breathing peace treaty in a pretty dress. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but surely some of these marriages worked out. Surely some couples found love eventually. And you know what? Some did. But here's the thing. When love did bloom in royal marriages, it was purely accidental. It was a happy side effect, not the goal. And when it did happen, it often caused more problems than it solved. Because personal happiness and political necessity rarely aligned perfectly. The system was designed to fail the individuals within it, while serving the greater political machine. And it worked flawlessly for centuries. But I know what you're wondering right now. If medieval royal marriages were such obvious scams, such blatant examples of treating people like property, why did everyone just go along with it? Why didn't anyone stand up and say, this is wrong? Why didn't the children themselves rebel against a system that was stealing their most basic human right, the right to choose who to love? Well, here's where our story gets even more heartbreaking, because the answer reveals something profound about how power works, how control is maintained, and how human beings can be systematically taught to surrender their own dreams. The truth is, these royal children didn't just accept their fate passively. They were actively trained, from the moment they could understand language, to believe that love itself was their enemy, and the methods used to break their spirits. They were more sophisticated and more cruel than anything you could imagine. The answer to those questions is more chilling than you might expect. Because medieval royal families didn't just accidentally stumble into a system that crushed their children's dreams, they perfected it. They turned the destruction of love into an art form, a science, a carefully orchestrated process that began before these children could even speak. Picture this. You're 3 years old, and instead of bedtime stories about brave knights rescuing princesses, you're told tales about princesses who saved kingdoms by marrying wisely. Instead of fairy tales about true love's kiss, you hear legends about queens who brought peace through strategic alliances. Your lullabies aren't about romance. They're about duty, honour, and the greater good. This was the reality for royal children. From their very first words, they were fed a carefully crafted narrative that love was selfish, that personal desires were weakness, and that their highest purpose was to serve as tools of statecraft. Let me tell you about something that happened in 1203 that perfectly illustrates this psychological conditioning when Princess Blanche of Castile was just 9 years old. She was given a wedding doll, a miniature bride figure dressed in the colours of France. But this wasn't a toy. It was a training device. Every day, little Blanche had to practice wedding ceremonies with this doll. She'd rehearse walking down imaginary aisles, saying imaginary vows to imaginary grooms. She'd practice the perfect curtsy, the perfect smile, the perfect expression of grateful submission. She was literally playing house, except the house was a political prison, and she was rehearsing for her own captivity. The genius of this system, and yes, I'm using the word genius in the most twisted way possible, was that it made the children complicit in their own emotional destruction. They weren't just victims. They were trained to be enthusiastic participants in their own sacrifice. But here's where it gets even more sophisticated. Medieval royal courts developed what we might call love substitutes. Elaborate rituals and relationships designed to fulfill a child's need for affection while keeping them safely away from anything resembling romantic autonomy. Royal children were surrounded by what they called courtly love, a stylized theatrical form of romance that was all performance and no substance. Young princes would write poems to ladies of the court. Young princesses would receive flowers and songs from noble admirers. It looked like romance. It felt like romance. But it was completely safe because everyone understood it was just a game. It was like giving a hungry person a plastic apple. It satisfies the visual craving without providing any actual nourishment. Princess Eleanor of Brittany wrote in her diary, which survived in a convent archive, about her confusion over these courtly rituals. "Today Sir Geoffrey brought me roses and spoke of my beauty," and she wrote, "but Mother explained that this is not love, merely practice for the real duties that await me." I wonder why we must practice something we are never meant to truly experience. She was 12 when she wrote that. 12 years old, and already grappling with the cognitive dissonance of a system that taught her to perform love while forbidding her to feel it. But you know what's absolutely heartbreaking? Some royal children became so skilled at these emotional performances that they lost track of their own authentic feelings. They became method actors in the tragedy of their own lives, so good at pretending to be content that they sometimes convinced themselves it was real. Take Prince John of England. Yes, the same John who would later become King John of Robin Hood fame. As a child, he was considered a model royal son because he enthusiastically embraced his arranged engagements. He wrote beautiful letters to his intended brides, expressed excitement about his future marriages, and publicly praised the wisdom of his parents' choices. But private letters discovered centuries later in monastery archives tell a different story. John suffered from what we'd now recognise as severe anxiety and depression. He had nightmares about his wedding day, panic attacks during marriage negotiations, and wrote desperate, coded messages to his tutors begging for escape from this golden cage. The boy who appeared to be the perfect, grateful royal son was actually screaming for help in a language no one bothered to learn. And here's what really gets me. The adults around these children genuinely believed they were being kind. They thought they were protecting their sons and daughters from the chaos of emotional choice. Medieval philosophy taught that strong emotions were literally dangerous to one's health and soul. Love, they believed, made people irrational, unpredictable, and therefore unfit to rule. King Louis VII of France wrote in a letter to his brother, "I save my children from the burden of passion, as I would save them from plague or poison. Better they should live in peace without love than die in chaos with it." He wasn't being cruel. He was being what he thought was protective. But what he didn't understand was that by removing love, he wasn't creating peace. He was creating a different kind of chaos. The chaos of living a life that never felt fully real. Now, you might be wondering, didn't any of these children fight back? Didn't anyone refuse to go along with the program? And here's where our story takes a fascinating turn. because some did rebel. But their rebellions revealed just how deeply the system had infiltrated their psyches. When royal children did resist their arranged marriages, they rarely argued for the right to choose their own partners. Instead, they asked for better arranged marriages, or they begged to enter religious life where marriage could be avoided altogether. They'd been so thoroughly convinced that love was impossible for people like them that they couldn't even imagine it as an option worth fighting for. Princess Constance of Antioch provides a perfect example. In 1130, at age 15, she staged what historians call the most dramatic royal rebellion of the 12th century. She barricaded herself in her chambers, refused to eat, and declared she would never submit to matrimonial slavery. Sounds like a love rebellion, right? But when negotiators finally got her to explain her demands, she wasn't asking for the right to marry for love. She was asking for the right to choose which strategic marriage would best serve her kingdom's interests. She'd been so thoroughly trained to think politically that even her rebellion was framed in terms of statecraft. She literally couldn't conceive of marriage as anything other than a political transaction. The system had succeeded in making her forget that any other kind of union was even possible. But here's what the royal families didn't count on. Human nature is remarkably stubborn. Love, it turns out, is like water. If you try to block it completely, it finds the most unexpected ways to seep through the cracks. And when it does break through in a medieval royal court, the results could be absolutely explosive. Some princes and princesses did fall in love deeply, desperately, dangerously in love. And when that happened, they faced a choice that would define not just their own lives, but the entire course of European history: surrender to the system that had shaped them since birth, or risk everything for the radical act of choosing their own hearts. As we're about to discover, when royal love became rebellion, it didn't just change individual lives. It toppled kingdoms, started wars, and rewrote the very rules of power itself. Because it turns out that love, when it's been suppressed long enough, doesn't just whisper when it finally breaks free, and it roars. And medieval Europe was about to learn just how loud that roar could be. That roar we talked about, it first echoed through the stone halls of Windsor Castle on a cold February morning in 1464, when 18-year-old King Edward IV of England did something so shocking, so absolutely unthinkable, that it sent tremors through every royal court in Europe. He fell in love. Real, genuine, head over heels, can't eat, can't sleep love. And then he did something even more scandalous. He acted on it. Edward was supposed to marry a French princess. The negotiations had been going on for months. Treaties were being drafted, dowries calculated. But Edward had a problem. He'd met Elizabeth Woodville, a widow with 2 children who was absolutely, completely, politically useless to him. She couldn't bring him a single acre of land, not one military alliance, not even a decent trade agreement. She was just beautiful and kind. And when she laughed at his jokes, he felt something he'd never experienced before. The pure, terrifying joy of being liked for himself, not for his crown. So, what did Edward do? He married her in secret. At dawn, with only her mother and a priest as witnesses, the King of England literally snuck out of his own castle to elope like a lovesick teenager, knowing full well it could cost him his throne. When the news broke, the reaction was swift and absolutely brutal. The French ambassador wrote to his king, "The English have gone mad. Their boy king has confused his kingdom for a romance novel." Parliament seriously considered declaring Edward mentally unfit to rule. His own mother publicly stated she wished she'd never given birth to him. But here's what makes Edward's story so fascinating. He didn't just defend his choice, he celebrated it. At his official wedding announcement, he stood before the entire court and said something that no medieval king had ever dared to say: "I have married for love, and I would rather be a happy commoner than a miserable king." The silence that followed was so complete that courtiers later described it as the sound of an entire worldview cracking. Because Edward had just committed the ultimate royal crime, he'd suggested that personal happiness might be more important than political duty. He'd chosen his heart over his kingdom. And somehow, the kingdom didn't collapse. England didn't fall into chaos. The sun still rose the next morning, and that terrified the other royal families of Europe more than any military threat ever could. But Edward's love rebellion was just the beginning. Once that crack appeared in the system, other royal hearts began to follow the light seeping through. And some of their stories will make you believe in the power of love to literally reshape the world. Take Prince Pedro of Portugal. In 1355, he was arranged to marry Constanza of Castile for obvious political reasons. But Pedro had already fallen desperately in love with Inés de Castro, a Spanish noblewoman who served in Constanza's court. The situation was impossible. Pedro couldn't break his engagement without starting a war. But he also couldn't marry Constanza while his heart belonged to someone else. So he found a third option that nobody saw coming. He married Constanza as planned, but he also secretly married Inés in a clandestine ceremony. He literally committed bigamy for love, creating the most complicated royal love triangle in medieval history. When both marriages were discovered, the political fallout was immediate and devastating. Constanza's family declared war. Pedro's father, King Afonso, ordered Inés to be executed for corrupting the royal bloodline. The Spanish courts called for Pedro to be disinherited, but Pedro's response was so romantic, so utterly devoted, that it's become legend. When he became king after his father's death, his first royal act was to have Inés's body exhumed and crowned as Queen of Portugal. He forced the entire court to kneel and pay homage to her corpse, declaring that death cannot diminish the throne of love. It sounds macabre, but to Pedro, it was the ultimate romantic gesture. He was saying, I don't care if you think love is weakness. I don't care if you think I'm crazy. This woman was my queen in life, and she'll be my queen in death, and your politics can't change that. The story spread across Europe like wildfire. Suddenly, royal courts everywhere were whispering about the Portuguese king who chose love over sanity, who crowned a corpse rather than deny his heart. Some called him mad, others called him magnificent, but everyone called him memorable. And here's what's absolutely fascinating. Pedro's reign was actually remarkably successful. Portugal prospered under his rule. The economy grew, and the people adored him. It turns out that a king who follows his heart might actually be more effective than one who follows a diplomatic handbook. But perhaps the most spectacular example of royal love rebellion happened in 1410, when Princess Catherine of Valois found herself caught between two impossible choices. She was arranged to marry Henry V of England to seal peace between France and England after decades of war. But Catherine had fallen in love with Owen Tudor, a Welsh courtier who was so far beneath her station that their marriage would be considered not just inappropriate, but legally treasonous. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If Catherine refused to marry Henry, the war between England and France would resume, potentially costing thousands of lives. If she married Henry while loving Owen, she'd be condemning herself to a lifetime of emotional torture. So Catherine did something brilliant. She married Henry V as planned, fulfilled her political duty, gave England an heir, and then, after Henry died, she secretly married Owen Tudor and lived the rest of her life for love. Her strategy was essentially, fine, I'll be your political pawn for a few years, but then I'm taking my life back. And it worked. Her secret marriage to Owen Tudor produced children who would eventually found the Tudor dynasty, meaning that some of England's greatest monarchs, including Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, descended from a love marriage that was supposed to be impossible. Catherine literally changed the course of English history by refusing to let politics permanently crush her heart. But these love rebellions didn't just affect individual lives. They started a revolution in how medieval society thought about marriage, choice, and the relationship between personal happiness and social duty. Because when royal children started choosing love over politics, it sent a message to every other young person in the kingdom. Maybe you don't have to accept the life other people plan for you either. Suddenly, merchant families were allowing their children more say in marriage choices. Noble houses were considering compatibility alongside dowries. The idea that love might be a legitimate factor in life, decisions started spreading through medieval society like a love song. But the established powers didn't give up without a fight. The more royal children rebelled for love, the more elaborate and cruel the system's responses became. And what happened next reveals just how far medieval institutions would go to maintain control over young hearts. Because if you think the training we talked about earlier was intense, wait until you hear about the lengths royal families went to when they realised their children were starting to fight back. The countermeasures they developed were so sophisticated, so psychologically devastating that they make modern propaganda look like amateur hour. And the children caught in this escalating war between love and power, they were about to face choices that no human being should ever have to make. Those impossible choices began to materialise almost immediately after Edward IV's love rebellion sent shockwaves through medieval Europe. The royal establishments across the continent realised that they were facing their worst nightmare. Their carefully constructed system was beginning to crack, and love was seeping through those cracks like water through a dam. Their response was swift, systematic, and absolutely ruthless. Welcome to what I call the medieval dating app from hell. Except this wasn't about finding love. It was about preventing it so thoroughly that royal children would never even dream of Edward IV's rebellion. You see, the old system had a fatal flaw. It allowed royal children to meet potential love interests at court, at ceremonies, during diplomatic visits. Those chance encounters, those stolen glances across a banquet hall, those conversations during a dance, they were creating exactly the kind of emotional connections that led to disasters like Edward's secret wedding. So the royal families got creative. Terrifyingly creative. In 1470, just 6 years after Edward's scandalous marriage, the French court implemented what they called the Portrait Protocol. From that point forward, royal children weren't allowed to meet their intended spouses until the actual wedding day. Instead, they would be shown painted portraits and given written descriptions of their future partners. But here's where it gets diabolical. These portraits were essentially medieval propaganda pieces designed to make the children fall in love with the political arrangements rather than actual people. Princess Anne of Brittany's experience perfectly illustrates how this system worked. In 1488, when she was 11 years old, she was shown a portrait of Maximilian of Austria, her intended husband. The painting depicted a handsome, noble-looking man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Anne was also given a beautifully written letter, supposedly from Maximilian, expressing his excitement about their future together and his admiration for her intelligence and beauty. Anne spent 3 years writing letters to this portrait, essentially falling in love with a fantasy. She developed elaborate daydreams about their life together, planned their conversations, even practiced what she would say when they finally met. The reality, when Anne finally met Maximilian on her wedding day, she discovered that the portrait had been painted 20 years earlier when he was young and attractive. The real Maximilian was now middle-aged, overweight, and suffering from what medieval physicians called melancholia, basically severe depression. The romantic letters. They'd been written by professional scribes who specialised in creating fake romantic correspondence. Anne had been catfished by the entire medieval political system. But the portrait scam was just the beginning. Royal courts began developing what we might call emotional isolation protocols. designed to prevent the children from forming any meaningful relationships that might compete with arranged marriages. Take the case of Prince Charles of Anjou in 1485. When Charles turned 14, the age when medieval boys typically began forming friendships and romantic interests, his father implemented something called the rotation system. Charles was never allowed to spend more than 2 weeks in the same location. He'd stay at one castle for a fortnight, then be moved to another, then another, then another. The official reason? To broaden the young prince's education and understanding of his future territories. The real reason? To prevent him from forming any lasting emotional bonds with anyone. Every time Charles started to connect with someone, a fellow page, a young lady of the court, even a mentor figure, he'd be whisked away before the relationship could deepen. Charles's private tutor wrote in a letter that survived in monastery archives, "The young prince has become like a ghost in his own life, present but never truly settled anywhere. He speaks to no one with real intimacy, trusts no one with his thoughts, and seems to believe that all human connections are temporary by nature." They had successfully trained a prince to be emotionally numb. Mission accomplished. But perhaps the most sophisticated manipulation involved what courts called compatibility theatre. This was the practice of staging elaborate romantic scenarios to make arranged marriages feel like love stories. Here's how it worked. Let's say Princess Isabella was arranged to marry Prince Ferdinand. Months before they met, both children would be told carefully crafted stories about their destined partner. Isabella would hear about Ferdinand's bravery, his kindness, his noble character. Ferdinand would hear about Isabella's beauty, her wit, her gentle nature. Then, when they finally met, the meeting would be orchestrated to feel magical and spontaneous. They'd accidentally encounter each other in a garden. Ferdinand would happen to recite poetry that Isabella had been told was his favourite. Isabella would coincidentally be wearing a colour that Ferdinand had supposedly mentioned loving. Every conversation was scripted. Every spontaneous moment was planned. Every shared interest was artificially manufactured. The children weren't falling in love with each other. They were falling in love with an elaborate theatrical production. The genius of this system was that it gave royal children the feeling of choosing their own partners, while keeping them completely within the bounds of political necessity. They felt like they were experiencing real romance, while actually being manipulated more thoroughly than ever before. Princess Joanna of Castile fell victim to perhaps the most elaborate version of this scam in 1496. She was told that her arranged marriage to Philip of Burgundy had been postponed indefinitely due to political complications. Meanwhile, she began receiving anonymous love letters from a mysterious admirer who seemed to understand her perfectly, who shared her interests in music and poetry, who made her feel seen and valued for who she truly was. Joanna fell deeply in love with her anonymous correspondent. She spent months writing passionate responses, sharing her deepest thoughts and dreams. She felt like she was experiencing the kind of pure spiritual connection that transcended political arrangements. Then, on her wedding day, she discovered that Philip of Burgundy had been her mysterious correspondent all along. The entire romance had been a setup designed to make her political marriage feel like a love story. Joanna's reaction reveals just how psychologically devastating these manipulations could be. Instead of feeling grateful for the elaborate effort to help her love her arranged husband, she felt betrayed and violated. In her diary, she wrote, "They have stolen not just my choice, but my very capacity to trust my own feelings. How can I believe in any emotion when I know it might be another performance designed for political purposes?" She had been so thoroughly manipulated that she could no longer distinguish between authentic feelings and manufactured ones. But you know what's absolutely fascinating? Even these sophisticated psychological manipulations couldn't completely crush the human spirit's need for authentic connection. Some royal children began developing what we might call emotional resistance strategies. They created secret languages, hidden friendships, covert ways of maintaining real human connections despite the system's attempts to isolate them. Some princesses would communicate their true feelings through flower arrangements. A yellow rose meant "I'm lonely." White lilies meant "I'm afraid." Red poppies meant "I remember what real love feels like." Some princes developed elaborate coded correspondence systems, writing letters that looked like formal diplomatic communications but actually contained personal messages hidden in specific word choices and letter spacing. They were essentially running underground emotional railways, smuggling authentic feelings through a system designed to eliminate them entirely. And here's where the story takes another fascinating turn. Because as these medieval dating app manipulations became more sophisticated, they started to backfire in unexpected ways. The royal children who were being most heavily controlled began to develop something the system hadn't anticipated. They became expert at detecting lies, manipulation, and emotional fraud. They had been so thoroughly trained to recognize fake romance that they became incredibly skilled at identifying the real thing when it appeared. And when that happened, when a genuinely authentic connection broke through all the elaborate defences, well, let's just say that a royal child who spent their entire life surrounded by emotional fakery knows the value of the real thing when they find it, and they're willing to risk everything to protect it. When that real thing finally appeared, it created some of the most legally complex and financially devastating documents in medieval history. Because here's what nobody talks about when they romanticize royal weddings. The paperwork behind these marriages was more complicated than modern corporate mergers, and infinitely more binding. Let me show you just how insane these marriage contracts really were by walking you through one that almost started World War Medieval. In 1469, the marriage contract between Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon wasn't just a wedding agreement. It was a 47-page legal document that essentially redesigned the map of Spain. And when I say 47 pages, I'm talking about dense, handwritten medieval script that would make modern tax law look like a children's book. Page 1 covered the basics. Who was marrying whom, when, and where. Pages 2 through 15 dealt with the dowry, but this wasn't just "here's some golden land." Isabella's dowry included entire cities, trading routes, mining rights, fishing territories, and something called future conquest rights, which basically meant Ferdinand would own half of any land Isabella might conquer later in life. Talk about ambitious wedding planning. But pages 16 through 31, that's where things got really wild. These pages covered what we might call genetic futures trading, detailed specifications about which children would inherit what, how many sons needed to be produced to secure the alliance. What would happen if Isabella died in childbirth? What would happen if Ferdinand died in battle? And even contingency plans for what would happen if both of them died but left pregnant mistresses. Yes, you heard that right. Medieval marriage contracts included provisions for hypothetical children from extramarital affairs. They were planning for infidelity before the couple had even said "I do." Pages 32 through 40 covered military obligations. When Isabella married Ferdinand, she wasn't just gaining a husband, she was contractually obligating her entire kingdom to provide military support for any wars Ferdinand might start for the rest of his life. Ferdinand, in turn, was legally bound to defend Isabella's territories, even if it meant bankrupting his own kingdom. Imagine signing a marriage certificate that automatically enrolled your entire family in your spouse's future fights. "Honey, I love you so much I'm willing to commit my father's army to whatever conflicts you might stumble into over the next 40 years. And the final 15 pages? Those dealt with what medieval lawyers called dissolution impossibilities, essentially an encyclopedia of reasons why this marriage could never ever be undone, no matter what happened. Adultery, incompatibility, religious differences, political disagreements, even if one spouse tried to assassinate the other, none of it mattered. The contract was more permanent than death itself. But here's what makes Isabella and Ferdinand's contract absolutely fascinating. It was considered relatively simple by medieval standards. Let me tell you about the marriage contract that nearly broke the medieval legal system entirely. In 1453, Margaret of Anjou's marriage to Henry VI of England required a team of 12 lawyers working for 8 months just to draft the agreement. The final contract was 89 pages long and included provisions so complex that they're still being debated by legal historians today. Margaret's dowry wasn't just property, it included what the contract called theoretical territories, meaning land that didn't exist yet but might be conquered in the future. Henry VI was essentially agreeing to marry Margaret in exchange for the possibility that maybe someday her family might win some wars and give him the hypothetical spoils. It was like getting married for Bitcoin when Bitcoin was still just a sketch on someone's napkin. But the truly insane part was the emotional performance clauses. Margaret's contract legally required her to appear happy in public, to speak positively about Henry in all correspondence, and to demonstrate marital affection in accordance with royal dignity at all public functions. They literally wrote mandatory happiness into the marriage contract. Margaret could be miserable in private, but her public joy was a legal obligation with specific financial penalties for non-compliance. The contract specified that if Margaret appeared melancholy, sullen, or insufficiently enthusiastic at public events more than 3 times per year, Henry's family could demand financial compensation from her dowry. They essentially put a price tag on fake smiles. Imagine having your emotional performance monitored by lawyers and accountants. Sorry, Your Majesty, but you've exceeded your annual sadness quota. That'll be 500 gold pieces and a written apology to the kingdom. Now, you might be thinking these contracts were just extreme examples from particularly dysfunctional royal families. But the truth is, every single royal marriage in medieval Europe involved similarly complex negotiations. The difference was just how openly they acknowledged the business nature of the transaction. Some families tried to maintain romantic pretenses by burying the brutal, contractual details in flowery language. Princess Anne of Bohemia's 1382 marriage contract to Richard II of England described her dowry as tokens of familial affection and hopes for future happiness. But when you read the fine print, those tokens included 15 castles, 6 entire towns, exclusive mining rights to 3 silver deposits, and legal ownership of any children she might have with anyone other than Richard. They were essentially saying, here's a romantic gift of massive territorial control and reproductive ownership rights. Isn't love beautiful? Other families went the opposite direction and treated marriage contracts like military treaties. The 1385 marriage agreement between John of Gaunt and Constance of Castile read more like a war plan than a wedding announcement. The couple's emotional relationship was mentioned exactly once, in a single sentence that basically said, the parties agree to maintain cordial personal relations sufficient to produce male heirs. Everything else was about troop movements, taxation rights, and strategic positioning for future conflicts. John wasn't marrying Constance. He was entering into a military alliance that happened to include periodic reproductive obligations. But here's what's absolutely mind-bending about these contracts. They often included clauses that would seem insane even by modern business standards. Some marriage agreements had provisions for performance reviews where the couple's relationship would be evaluated annually by a panel of advisors to ensure they were fulfilling their contractual obligations. Others included upgrade clauses where one spouse could renegotiate the terms of the marriage if their family's political position improved significantly. Imagine having to get your in-laws' permission before getting a promotion because it might affect your marriage contract. And my personal favourite, some contracts included compatibility guarantees, where families could demand partial refunds of dowries if the married couple turned out to be temperamentally unsuited for productive collaboration. They literally had return policies on marriages. Sorry, these personalities don't mesh well. Can we get store credit toward a different spouse? The complexity of these contracts created an entire industry of medieval marriage lawyers who specialised in nothing but royal wedding negotiations. Some of these lawyers spent decades working on single contracts, becoming experts in the most minute details of territorial law, inheritance customs, and diplomatic protocol. There's a surviving letter from one such lawyer, Master Guillaume de Nogent, where he complains to a colleague, "I have spent 3 years negotiating the precise definition of marital affection for the Burgundy alliance. We are currently deadlocked over whether hand-holding in public should be classified as mandatory courtesy or optional romantic display. 3 years, arguing about hand-holding clauses for one wedding." But perhaps the most revealing aspect of these contracts was how they handled the possibility of love developing between the spouses. Most agreements included specific provisions about what would happen if the couple actually started to care about each other. Some contracts prohibited emotional attachment entirely, treating love as a breach of contract that could void the entire arrangement. Others allowed for controlled affection, but specified that romantic feelings could never supersede political obligations. And a few particularly paranoid families included love detection protocols, where the couple would be monitored for signs of genuine attachment that might interfere with their strategic decision-making. They were so afraid of love that they hired people to watch for it and eliminate it if it appeared. Medieval marriage contracts didn't just ignore love, they actively worked to prevent it. But here's what all these elaborate legal machinations couldn't account for: human creativity in the face of impossible restrictions. Because when you make love illegal, people don't stop loving, they just get more creative about how they express it. And the creative solutions some royal couples developed to maintain authentic connection within these contractual prisons, they were so ingenious, so romantic, and so dangerous that they threatened to bring down the entire system from the inside. Now, I need to tell you about one of the most bizarre and frankly disturbing practices in medieval royal marriage history. Something so strange that when I first read about it in historical archives, I thought it had to be a joke. But it wasn't. This was completely real, completely legal, and completely insane. Welcome to the world of proxy weddings, where royal marriages were so political that the bride and groom didn't even need to be in the same country, or sometimes even the same continent, to get married. Picture this. You're a medieval princess, maybe 14 years old, standing in a beautiful cathedral wearing your finest gown. There's music, flowers, hundreds of witnesses, all the pageantry of a royal wedding. You walk down the aisle, you say your vows, you even exchange rings with your new husband, except your husband isn't there. Instead, you're marrying his representative, usually some random duke or ambassador who's literally standing in for the actual groom. You're promising to love, honour, and obey a man you've never met, represented by a stranger who might not even know your husband's first name. This wasn't a rare occurrence. This was standard operating procedure for medieval royal marriages. In fact, proxy weddings were so common that the Catholic Church had to develop specific rules about how to make them legally binding. Let me tell you about the most absolutely ridiculous proxy wedding in medieval history. In 1396, 6-year-old Princess Isabella of Valois was married to 29-year-old King Richard II of England. But here's the kicker. Richard was busy fighting a war in Ireland and couldn't make it to the ceremony. So who stood in for the King of England at his own wedding? The Earl of Nottingham, a man who had never met Richard personally and had been chosen for the job literally because he was the right height to make the ceremony look visually appropriate. Isabella, who was 6 years old, stood next to this complete stranger and promised to be a faithful wife to a man she wouldn't meet for another 3 years. The Earl of Nottingham, wearing Richard's colours, slipped a ring onto this child's finger and kissed her cheek to seal the deal. And here's the most insane part, this marriage was considered completely legal and binding. Isabella was officially the Queen of England based on a ceremony where the groom was represented by someone who was essentially a well-dressed stranger hired for the day. It was like getting married through a temp agency. But proxy weddings could get even weirder. Some ceremonies involved what medieval law called symbolic consummation, a ritual designed to make the marriage legally complete even though the actual husband was hundreds of miles away. In 1420, Princess Catherine of Valois was married by proxy to King Henry V of England. During the ceremony, Catherine was required to lie on a bed while the proxy groom, the Duke of Bedford, placed his leg on top of the covers next to her. This bizarre ritual was supposed to symbolically represent the marriage being consummated, making it legally unbreakable under church law. Imagine explaining that to your therapist. Well, I married a king I'd never met, represented by his brother, who put his leg on my bed while 3 bishops watched and took notes. The whole thing was so surreal that Catherine later wrote in her diary, "Today I became wife to a stranger through the leg of another stranger while surrounded by men in robes who assured me this made perfect sense according to God's law." But here's where proxy weddings reveal something truly dark about medieval royal marriages. They made it crystal clear that the bride's consent was completely irrelevant. These ceremonies could happen without any input from the people actually getting married. Princess Joan of Navarre discovered this in the most traumatic way possible in 1419. She woke up one morning to discover that she'd been married by proxy the night before without her knowledge. Her father had arranged the ceremony, chosen a proxy, and completed the entire wedding while Joan slept in the next room. When she was informed that she was now officially married to Duke John of Brittany, Joan asked the logical question, "Can I meet my husband before I have to start living with him?" The answer was no. Joan was told that meeting her husband before joining him in Brittany would be inappropriate, since she was now a married woman and needed to maintain proper dignity. So Joan was shipped off to Brittany to begin married life with a man whose face she had never seen, whose voice she had never heard, whose personality was a complete mystery to her. Her first conversation with her husband happened when she arrived at his castle and introduced herself as his wife. "Hello, I'm Joan, your wife. Apparently we got married last week." Surprise! But perhaps the most elaborate proxy wedding scam involved Princess Margaret of Scotland in 1469. Margaret was arranged to marry Charles the Bold of Burgundy, but Charles was notorious for being, well, completely insane. His own family was embarrassed by his erratic behaviour, and several previous marriage negotiations had fallen through when potential brides' families discovered just how unstable he was. So Charles's advisors came up with a brilliant solution. They hired an actor to serve as proxy groom. Not just any actor, a handsome, charming, well-spoken performer who could make Margaret fall in love with the proxy instead of dreading meeting the real Charles. The plan was diabolical in its cleverness. Margaret would have a beautiful wedding ceremony with this attractive, charismatic proxy. She'd spend her wedding day charmed and delighted, thinking that marriage to Charles might actually be wonderful. Then, by the time she discovered the truth, she'd already be legally bound and living in Burgundy where escape would be impossible. The actor they hired was so good at his job that Margaret wrote to her mother after the ceremony, "My husband's representative is the most wonderful man I have ever met. If Charles is anything like his proxy, I shall be the happiest woman in Europe." The truth came out 3 months later when Margaret arrived in Burgundy and discovered that Charles the Bold was nothing like his charming representative. Charles was paranoid, violent, and had a disturbing habit of talking to his horses more than to human beings. Margaret's second letter to her mother tells a very different story. "I have been deceived in the cruelest possible way. The man I married through proxy was everything wonderful. The man I must live with is a nightmare. They have stolen not just my choice, but my hope." The psychological impact of these proxy weddings was devastating in ways that medieval society didn't even attempt to understand. These young women experienced all the emotional intensity of a wedding day, the nervousness, the excitement, the sense of stepping into a new life, but directed toward a complete fiction. Some brides fell in love with their proxy grooms and spent months or even years fantasizing about reunion with these men, not knowing they'd never see them again. Others became so attached to the proxy ceremony that they refused to accept their real husbands as legitimate, insisting that their true marriage was to the representative. Princess Eleanor of Portugal actually tried to have her proxy marriage declared her only valid marriage, arguing in church court that since she had given her heart to the proxy groom, her later relationship with her actual husband was essentially adultery. The church was not amused by this theological argument. But here's what's absolutely fascinating about proxy weddings. They accidentally created some of the most romantic correspondence in medieval history. Because when couples were married by proxy, they often spent months or years writing letters to each other before they actually met. Some of these letter exchanges are breathtakingly beautiful, not because they represent real love, but because they show two people desperately trying to create authentic connection through the artificial constraints of their situation. Prince Ferdinand of Aragon and Princess Isabella of Castile exchanged over 200 letters during the year between their proxy wedding and their first meeting. Reading these letters is like watching two people fall in love with idealized versions of each other, creating elaborate fantasies about their future life together based on carefully crafted written personas. Ferdinand wrote, "My beloved wife, whom I have never seen, I dream of the day when we shall walk together in gardens I have never visited. In the kingdom we shall build with hearts, I pray will beat in harmony." Isabella responded, "My dear husband, who exists in my thoughts but not my sight, I imagine your voice speaking these beautiful words, and I wonder if the man behind them could possibly be as wonderful as the words themselves." They were essentially having a medieval long-distance relationship based entirely on letters and imagination. And for one brief, shining year, before reality set in, it was actually kind of magical. But the magic couldn't survive the brutal transition from fantasy to reality. Because when proxy married couples finally met face to face, they had to reconcile the elaborate romantic personas they'd created through letters with the actual human being standing in front of them. And most of the time, the real people couldn't possibly live up to the fictional characters they'd been writing. The gap between expectation and reality was so vast that many proxy marriages immediately collapsed into disappointment, resentment, and mutual disillusionment. These couples had been set up to fail before they'd even met. They'd been encouraged to fall in love with ideas, fantasies, and projections, then forced to build real marriages with actual people who couldn't possibly match their impossible expectations. But occasionally, just occasionally, something unexpected happened during these proxy to reality transitions. Sometimes, the real person turned out to be more interesting than the fantasy. Sometimes the actual marriage became more authentic than the elaborate courtship that preceded it. And when that happened, when two people who'd been manipulated into a political arrangement somehow found genuine connection despite all the obstacles, well, that's when medieval marriages became something truly revolutionary. Something that could change not just individual lives, but the entire course of history itself. But before we explore those revolutionary moments, we need to talk about something that's going to make you understand just how completely medieval royal brides were treated as property rather than people. Because what I'm about to tell you about the economic calculations behind these marriages will shock you, not just because of the numbers involved, but because of how coldly, how precisely, these families calculated the monetary value of a human being. Medieval royal brides weren't just expensive, they were literally the most expensive commodities in the medieval economy. And I'm not talking expensive like a luxury car or a nice house. I'm talking expensive like buying a small country, because that's essentially what these families were doing. Let me give you some numbers that'll make your head spin. In 1468, when Charles the Bold of Burgundy married Margaret of York, the total cost of the marriage, including dowry, wedding expenses, and what medieval accountants called alliance investment, came to approximately 400,000 gold florins. To put that in perspective, that amount of money could have purchased 2,000 fully equipped warships, or hired an army of 50,000 soldiers for an entire year, or built 12 major cathedrals. Margaret of York's marriage cost more than most countries' entire annual GDP. She was literally worth more than some kingdoms. But here's what makes these calculations even more disturbing. Medieval royal families had detailed accounting systems that broke down a bride's value into specific categories. Margaret of York's bride assessment document, which survived in the Burgundian archives, lists her worth in categories like a medieval spreadsheet from hell. Physical attributes, 50,000 florins. This covered her beauty, her health, her estimated childbearing potential, and what the document charmingly calls her decorative value at state functions. Political connections, 150,000 florins. This was the estimated value of her family's military alliances, trading relationships, and diplomatic influence. Territorial rights, 100,000 florins. Margaret brought claims to various English lands and trading routes that could potentially be valuable in future negotiations. Breeding potential, 75,000 florins. Yes, you read that right. Medieval accountants calculated the estimated value of the children Margaret might produce, based on statistical analysis of her family's reproductive history. And finally, symbolic value, 25,000 florins. This was the prestige boost that Burgundy would gain by marrying into English royalty. They literally itemised a human being like she was a complex business acquisition. Margaret wasn't marrying Charles. She was being purchased by Burgundy as a comprehensive political investment package. But Margaret's case wasn't unusually dehumanising. This kind of economic analysis was standard practice for every royal marriage in medieval Europe. Spanish royal archives contain a document called the Princess Pricing Protocol, a systematic guide for calculating the monetary value of potential royal brides. The protocol includes sections on age-based depreciation, younger brides were worth more, beauty multiplication factors, attractive brides could add 20 to 30% to their base value, and political volatility adjustments. Brides from unstable kingdoms were offered at discount rates. They had actuarial tables for human beings, insurance companies for royal marriages, risk assessment protocols for princess purchases. Princess Isabella of Portugal's 1490 marriage evaluation sheet includes a section labelled Defect Discounts that lists various physical or personality traits that would reduce her market value. Being excessively pious was worth a 5% reduction. Having a melancholic temperament meant a 10% discount. Being overly educated, meaning able to read and write beyond basic levels, was actually considered a liability worth a 15% price reduction. Being too smart made you less valuable as a royal bride. Intelligence was literally listed as a defect. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of these economic calculations was the category medieval accountants called replacement insurance. Royal families actually calculated the cost of replacing a bride if she died in childbirth, became seriously ill, or, and this is where it gets really dark, if she turned out to be unsuitable for royal duties. Princess Anne of Brittany's marriage contract includes a clause requiring her family to provide a substitute bride of equivalent value if Anne died within the first 5 years of marriage. Her younger sister was literally designated as a backup wife, held in reserve in case the primary bride didn't work out. Imagine growing up knowing you were the understudy in your sister's marriage, waiting in the wings in case she died or failed to perform adequately. But here's where these cold economic calculations reveal something profound about how medieval royal marriages actually functioned. Because brides were so expensive, their families had massive financial incentives to make sure the marriages succeeded. Not because they cared about their daughter's happiness, but because divorce or annulment meant losing an enormous investment. When Princess Joanna of Castile's marriage to Philip of Burgundy began falling apart in 1504, her parents didn't offer emotional support or marriage counselling. Instead, they hired what medieval documents call marriage performance consultants, essentially relationship coaches whose job was to help Joanna be a more effective political wife. These consultants taught Joanna techniques for managing Philip's temperament, strategies for maintaining his political interest in Spanish alliances, and methods for making herself more diplomatically useful to her husband. They weren't trying to save her marriage, they were trying to protect their investment. The invoice for these services, which survived in Spanish royal archives, includes line items for husband management training, political conversation coaching, and strategic affection deployment techniques. They were literally teaching Joanna to fake her way through marriage more effectively, but the economic pressure worked both ways. Because royal families invested so much money in acquiring brides, they also had strong incentives to extract maximum value from their purchases. This led to what medieval documents euphemistically call productivity optimization, systematic efforts to ensure that royal wives generated appropriate returns on their family's investments. Princess Margaret of Anjou's performance evaluation documents from her marriage to Henry VI of England read like modern corporate reviews. Her in-laws assessed her diplomatic effectiveness, her success at producing heirs, her ability to maintain international relationships, and her skill at representing English interests at foreign courts. She was literally getting annual performance reviews from her husband's family, with specific metrics for success and improvement goals for the following year. One particularly brutal evaluation from 1455 notes, Princess Margaret has exceeded expectations in diplomatic correspondence and court representation, but has failed to meet reproductive targets. Recommend increased focus on primary duties in the coming year. They were criticising her for not getting pregnant fast enough, using the language of a business quarterly report. But here's what's absolutely fascinating. Some royal brides figured out how to game this economic system to their own advantage. Because once families invested huge amounts of money in acquiring a particular bride, they became incredibly reluctant to lose that investment through divorce or annulment. Smart princesses learned to leverage their family's financial investment as protection against abuse or mistreatment. If their husbands threatened them, they could essentially say, "Go ahead, get rid of me, but explain to your parents why you're throwing away 300,000 gold florins." Princess Isabella of Castile used this strategy brilliantly during her marriage negotiations with Ferdinand of Aragon, when Ferdinand's family tried to insert clauses that would limit her political authority. Isabella threatened to withdraw from the marriage entirely. The financial panic that followed was immediate and intense. Ferdinand's family had already invested enormous sums in the marriage negotiations, planned expensive ceremonies, and committed to various political alliances based on the anticipated union. Cancelling the marriage would have been financially catastrophic. So Isabella got everything she wanted. Not because Ferdinand's family respected her wishes, but because they couldn't afford to lose their investment in her. She had essentially held herself hostage for a better marriage contract. And it worked. This economic leverage gave some royal brides a strange kind of power, not the power to choose their own lives, but the power to negotiate better terms within the system that owned them. They couldn't escape the cage, but they could sometimes make the cage more comfortable. But this financial protection only worked as long as the bride remained valuable to her husband's family. And medieval royal families had developed increasingly sophisticated methods for reducing a bride's value if she became inconvenient, methods that could transform a 400,000 florin princess into a liability virtually overnight. And when royal families decided they wanted out of their expensive investments, The techniques they used to devalue and dispose of inconvenient wives were so cruel, so legally complex, and so financially devastating that they make modern divorce proceedings look like friendly handshakes. The cruelest part about those disposal techniques was that they were disguised as romantic theatre. Medieval royal families discovered that the most effective way to destroy an inconvenient wife was to make it look like they were protecting the sanctity of marriage itself. Let me tell you about something so twisted, so psychologically devastating, that it makes modern gaslighting look like amateur hour. This is the story of what medieval courts called the consummation nightmare, and I promise you, what you're about to hear will change how you think about royal weddings forever. You see, medieval law required that marriages be consummated, physically completed, to be legally valid. But royal families turned this requirement into the most humiliating, traumatic, and publicly invasive ritual in human history. Picture this. You're a 14-year-old princess who's just been married to a complete stranger. You're scared, you're homesick, you've never been alone with a man before, and you have no idea what to expect. Now imagine that your first intimate moment as a married woman happens not in private, but with dozens of witnesses watching, taking notes, and offering commentary. This was standard procedure for royal marriages. The bride and groom didn't get privacy for their wedding night. They got an audience. In 1396, when 6-year-old Isabella of Valois finally reached marriageable age and joined her husband Richard II in England, the consummation ceremony was witnessed by 12 bishops, 6 nobles from each family, 4 physicians, and 2 legal scribes whose job was to document everything that happened. Everything. In writing. With timestamps. Isabella's consummation record, which survived in Westminster Abbey archives, is one of the most disturbing documents in medieval history. It describes a terrified teenage girl being essentially examined like livestock to ensure she was suitable for royal purposes, then forced into intimacy while strangers watched and commented on her performance. The record includes notes like, "The Queen showed appropriate modesty but insufficient enthusiasm," and physical evidence of consummation was observed and confirmed by medical examination. They were grading her wedding night like it was a performance review. But Isabella's experience was actually considered merciful by medieval standards, because at least she was old enough to understand what was happening to her. Some royal brides were so young that the consummation ceremony became an exercise in legalised child abuse witnessed by the highest levels of church and state. When Margaret Beaufort was married to John de la Pole in 1443, she was 6 years old. The consummation ceremony involved Margaret being placed in a bed with her adult husband, while witnesses confirmed that the marriage had been symbolically completed. Margaret later wrote that she had no understanding of what was happening, only that many important men watched me lie next to a stranger and seemed pleased when I cried. The psychological trauma of these ceremonies was devastating and permanent. Many royal wives never recovered from the experience of having their most intimate moments turned into public spectacles. They developed what we'd now recognise as severe PTSD, but medieval medicine labelled their symptoms as feminine hysteria or weakness of character. Princess Joan of Kent wrote in her private diary, "They have stolen not just my privacy, but my ability to feel that my own body belongs to me. Even when I am alone, I feel watched, examined, judged. I suspect I shall never feel truly alone again." But here's where the consummation nightmare gets even more twisted. Royal families use these ceremonies as tools of political control. If they wanted to invalidate a marriage later, they could claim that the consummation had been insufficient or improperly witnessed, or lacking in canonical requirements. Essentially, they created a system where royal wives could have their marriages declared invalid based on their performance during the most traumatic night of their lives. Princess Blanche of Lancaster discovered this in 1359 when her husband's family decided they wanted out of their marriage alliance. 3 years after her wedding, church officials suddenly announced that her consummation ceremony had been canonically deficient because she had shown excessive distress during the proceedings. They were literally annulling her marriage because she had been too upset during her own sexual assault. The legal reasoning was breathtakingly cruel. If a bride was too distressed during consummation, it suggested that she hadn't truly consented to the marriage, which made the entire union invalid. But this interpretation was only applied when it was politically convenient to get rid of an inconvenient wife. When families wanted to keep their marriages intact, the same level of distress was interpreted as appropriate feminine modesty that actually proved the bride's virtue and the marriage's validity. They had created a system where a woman's traumatic reaction to public sexual violation could be used either to validate or invalidate her marriage, depending on her family's current political usefulness. But the consummation nightmare didn't end with the wedding night. Many royal marriages included fertility verification protocols, regular medical examinations designed to monitor the wife's reproductive progress and ensure she was fulfilling her biological obligations. Princess Catherine of Aragon underwent monthly examinations throughout her marriage to Henry VIII, with detailed reports sent to both Spanish and English courts documenting her menstrual cycles, physical health, and pregnancy status. When she failed to produce a surviving male heir after several years, these medical reports became evidence in Henry's campaign to annul their marriage. Catherine's private physician wrote in a letter that survived in Vatican archives, "The Queen endures these examinations with great dignity, though I observe that they cause her profound distress. She has confided that she feels more like a breeding animal than a human being, monitored and measured for productivity rather than treated with the respect due to her station." Henry VIII's response to this medical surveillance was to demand even more frequent examinations, arguing that Catherine's evident discomfort with the procedures suggested she was hiding reproductive deficiencies that threatened the stability of the English succession. They were using her natural desire for privacy as evidence that she was failing in her duties as a wife. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the consummation nightmare was how it affected royal couples' ability to develop genuine intimate relationships. When your first sexual experience happens in front of an audience taking notes, when your reproductive life is constantly monitored by strangers, when your most private moments are treated as matters of state policy, how do you ever learn to trust, to be vulnerable, to experience authentic intimacy? Many royal couples never did. Even marriages that lasted for decades often remained essentially stranger relationships between two people who shared a bed and a title, but never truly knew each other. Prince Philip of Spain and Queen Mary III of England were married for 4 years, but their private correspondence reveals that they remained almost completely emotionally disconnected. Philip wrote to his confessor, "I share a household with the Queen, but I cannot say I share a life with her. We are intimate strangers, performing intimacy for the observers who never leave us alone." Mary's letters to her sister Elizabeth are even more heartbreaking. "I am married to a man I do not know, observed by people I cannot trust, expected to find joy in circumstances designed to eliminate all possibility of joy. I begin to understand that royal marriage is not meant to create happiness, but to destroy the very possibility that happiness might interfere with duty." They had created a system that systematically destroyed the emotional foundation necessary for healthy relationships, then blamed the couples when their marriages failed to produce happiness or even basic compatibility. But here's what's absolutely remarkable about human resilience. Even within this nightmare system, some royal couples found ways to create authentic connection. They developed secret languages, hidden rituals, private spaces where they could be real with each other despite the constant surveillance and political pressure. Some couples created elaborate codes for communicating genuine feelings through official correspondence. Others established secret meeting places within their own castles where they could briefly escape the performance of royal marriage and just be human together. These small acts of rebellion, choosing authenticity within a system designed to eliminate it, represent some of the most romantic gestures in history, not because they were grand or dramatic, but because they were real in a world that demanded everything else be fake. And occasionally, very occasionally, these authentic connections grew strong enough to challenge the entire system. When royal couples discovered genuine love within their political arrangements, they sometimes found the courage to reject the nightmare of public performance and demand something revolutionary, the right to be real with each other. And when that happened, when love became stronger than politics, when authentic connection challenged the machinery of royal marriage, well, that's when individual rebellions began to shake the foundations of the entire medieval world. Sometimes those individual rebellions exploded into full-scale disasters that literally redrew the map of Europe. And nowhere is this more dramatically illustrated than in the spectacular failures of royal marriages that were supposed to prevent wars but instead started them. Let me tell you about the most catastrophically backfired royal marriage in medieval history. A wedding that was designed to bring peace between two kingdoms, but instead triggered a conflict that lasted over a century and killed millions of people. In 1152, Eleanor of Aquitaine was married to Louis VII of France, in what was supposed to be the ultimate diplomatic triumph. Eleanor brought with her the largest, richest territory in medieval Europe, essentially half of what we now call France. The marriage was meant to unite these territories with the French crown forever, creating an unbreakable alliance that would bring unprecedented peace and prosperity. Instead, it launched the 100 Years' War. Here's what happened. Eleanor and Louis were completely fundamentally incompatible as human beings. Louis was deeply religious, introverted, and believed that royal life should be focused on spiritual matters and careful governance. Eleanor was vibrant, politically ambitious, and believed that royal life should be dynamic, culturally rich, and intellectually stimulating. Their marriage became a 15-year battle between two completely different visions of what royal life should look like. Louis wanted a quiet, pious wife who would support his spiritual leadership. Eleanor wanted a dynamic partner who could match her intellect and political sophistication. Neither of them got what they wanted, and their mutual frustration played out on the international stage. The breaking point came in 1149 during the Second Crusade. Eleanor accompanied Louis to the Holy Land, but their public disagreements during the campaign were so intense that other crusade leaders wrote worried letters back to Europe describing the French royal couple as more focused on battling each other than battling the infidels. Eleanor and Louis had literally taken their marital problems to war and made them everyone else's problem. When they returned to France, their relationship was beyond repair. But here's where the marriage scam aspect becomes crystal clear. Even though Eleanor and Louis couldn't stand each other, even though their marriage was making both of them miserable, even though their conflicts were destabilizing international relations, they couldn't get divorced. Medieval marriage law made royal divorce nearly impossible, especially when enormous territories were involved. The church argued that God had blessed their union. The nobles argued that too much land was at stake, and both families had invested too much political capital to admit the marriage was a failure. So Eleanor and Louis were trapped in a relationship that was destroying them both. With no legal way out, Eleanor's solution was characteristically dramatic. In 1152, she convinced the church to annul her marriage on the grounds of consanguinity, essentially arguing that she and Louis were too closely related for their marriage to be valid. It was a legal technicality that everyone knew was nonsense, but it was the only escape route available. The annulment was granted. Eleanor got her freedom, and everyone thought the problem was solved. They were catastrophically wrong. 2 months after her annulment from Louis, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, who would soon become Henry II of England. She essentially took the richest territory in Europe and handed it to France's greatest rival. The political earthquake was immediate and devastating. Louis VII had lost not just his wife, but half his kingdom. The territories that were supposed to be permanently united with France were now controlled by the English crown. The marriage that was designed to create lasting peace had instead created the fundamental territorial conflict that would dominate European politics for the next 300 years. Eleanor's divorce didn't just end a bad marriage, it accidentally started the 100 Years' War. But Eleanor and Louis weren't the only royal couple whose marriage disaster had international consequences. The 1469 marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon was supposed to unite Spain under a stable dual monarchy that would bring peace to the Iberian Peninsula. Instead, it created a power-sharing arrangement so complex and contentious that Isabella and Ferdinand spent more time fighting each other than governing their kingdoms. The marriage contract specified that Isabella and Ferdinand would rule as equal monarchs of their combined territories. But medieval law had no precedent for dual monarchy between spouses, so every decision required elaborate negotiations between two royal courts that were theoretically unified but practically independent. The result was governmental chaos. Important decisions took months to make because every policy had to be approved by both monarchs, who often disagreed about fundamental questions of governance, foreign relations, and military strategy. Spanish royal archives contain hundreds of documents detailing Isabella and Ferdinand's political disagreements, including a 1478 memo where Isabella's advisors recommend that she consider temporary separation from His Majesty, because their policy conflicts were paralysing the functioning of the state. They were essentially recommending a trial separation for political efficiency. The irony is that Isabella and Ferdinand actually liked each other personally. Their private letters revealed genuine affection and mutual respect, but the marriage structure that was supposed to create unity instead created an ungovernable political system where two competent rulers constantly undermined each other's authority. Their personal compatibility couldn't overcome the structural impossibility of their political arrangement. But perhaps the most spectacular royal marriage backfire involved Princess Margaret of Anjou and King Henry VI of England. This marriage was arranged in 1445 specifically to end the ongoing conflicts between England and France that had been raging for decades. Margaret was supposed to be the peacemaking queen who would use her French connections to establish lasting harmony between the two kingdoms. Instead, she became the most hated woman in England and one of the primary causes of the Wars of the Roses. Here's what went wrong. Margaret was an incredibly capable, politically sophisticated woman who was married to Henry VI, who was not. Henry was sweet-natured and well-meaning, but he suffered from what historians now believe was severe mental illness that made him completely unsuited for royal leadership. So Margaret essentially became the de facto ruler of England while Henry dealt with his psychological struggles. She made military decisions, managed diplomatic relations, and handled most of the day-to-day governance of the kingdom. Under normal circumstances, this might have worked. Margaret was talented enough to be an effective ruler. But she was French, and the English nobility couldn't accept being governed by a foreign woman, especially one from their traditional enemy nation. Margaret's every decision was interpreted through the lens of French conspiracy theories. When she made military alliances, English nobles accused her of secretly helping France. When she managed trade negotiations, they claimed she was undermining English economic interests. When she tried to address Henry's mental health issues, they accused her of plotting to usurp his throne. Margaret found herself in an impossible position. She was qualified to rule but forbidden from ruling openly, married to a man who needed care but expected to provide leadership, foreign-born but required to represent English interests, and powerful but constantly accused of abusing her power. The stress of this impossible situation drove Margaret to make increasingly desperate decisions. She began relying on a small circle of trusted advisors, which made her appear secretive and conspiratorial. She started making unilateral decisions without consulting Parliament, which made her appear tyrannical. she began using her French connections to gather political intelligence, which made her appear treasonous. Every survival strategy Margaret employed to navigate her impossible situation was used as evidence that she was exactly the kind of dangerous foreign influence the English nobility had feared. By 1455, Margaret had become so politically toxic that her mere presence at court was considered a threat to English stability. The marriage that was supposed to bring peace between England and France had instead convinced the English that French influence was inherently corrupting and dangerous. Margaret's marriage hadn't prevented war. It had taught an entire generation of English nobles that international marriage alliances were fundamentally untrustworthy. The Wars of the Roses began in 1455, and while the causes were complex, Margaret's failed queenship played a central role in convincing English noble families that foreign marriages were too dangerous to be allowed to continue. These marriage disasters revealed something profound about the medieval royal marriage system. It was built on the assumption that personal compatibility didn't matter, that individual happiness was irrelevant, that two people could be forced into successful partnerships purely through political pressure and legal constraints. But human beings, it turns out, are more complicated than political theories. When you force incompatible people into high-stakes partnerships, when you ignore personality differences in favour of territorial calculations, when you assume that shared interests can overcome fundamental incompatibility, you don't get successful marriages. You get spectacular failures that can destabilise entire continents. And the most dangerous failures were yet to come. Because as medieval royal families learned from these disasters, they began developing even more sophisticated methods for controlling royal marriages, methods that would push the boundaries of human manipulation so far that some royal children would be driven to choices that shocked medieval Europe to its core. The most shocking choice of all came from the one place medieval society least expected rebellion, the church itself. Because when royal children couldn't escape their arranged marriages through normal means, some of them discovered the ultimate loophole: they could marry God instead. What I'm about to tell you represents one of the most dramatic forms of medieval resistance, and it created a crisis that shook both the church and royal families to their very foundations. In 1212, Princess Clare of Assisi did something so radical, so completely unthinkable, that it sent shockwaves through every royal court in Europe. On the night before her arranged wedding to a German nobleman, she literally ran away from home, cut off all her hair, and declared herself married to Jesus Christ. Now, this wasn't just a teenage tantrum or a spiritual awakening. Clare had planned this escape with military precision. She coordinated with local monks, arranged for secret transportation, and even had a backup plan in case her family tried to forcibly retrieve her from the convent. But here's what makes Clare's story absolutely fascinating. Her family couldn't do anything about it. Medieval law was crystal clear that once someone took religious vows, they were permanently removed from secular marriage obligations. Clare had found the one legal loophole that trumped even royal authority. She had essentially divorced herself from the entire system of royal marriage by marrying someone her parents couldn't negotiate with. Clare's dramatic escape inspired a wave of similar rebellions throughout medieval Europe. Suddenly, convents were flooded with applications from royal daughters who preferred religious marriage to political marriage. These young women had figured out that becoming a nun was the only socially acceptable way to choose their own destiny. But royal families weren't going to let their valuable marriage assets escape that easily. They began developing what medieval documents call preemptive vocation prevention, essentially sophisticated systems for identifying and stopping religious rebellions before they could happen. Princess Isabella of France discovered just how elaborate these prevention systems could be in 1247 when she began showing interest in religious life. Isabella's family immediately assigned her a team of spiritual advisors whose real job was to convince her that God actually wanted her to serve him through royal marriage rather than through religious vows. These advisors used every psychological manipulation technique available They told Isabella that her arranged marriage was actually a divine calling, that God needed her to strengthen Christian alliances through political union, that refusing marriage would be disobeying God's plan for her life. They essentially weaponized religion against religious rebellion. When psychological manipulation wasn't enough, royal families resorted to what medieval records call convent infiltration. They would place family agents within convents to monitor their daughters and report any signs of serious religious commitment that might interfere with marriage plans. Princess Margaret of Hungary learned this the hard way in 1254, when she discovered that 3 of the nuns in her preferred convent were actually spies sent by her mother to ensure that Margaret's religious interests remained appropriately superficial. Margaret wrote in a letter that survived in monastery archives, "I cannot even pray without wondering if my words are being reported to those who would use my faith against me. They have made even my relationship with God into another form of surveillance." But some royal daughters found even more creative ways to escape arranged marriages. Princess Hedwig of Silesia pioneered what historians call strategic invalidity, deliberately making herself unmarriageable through actions that technically didn't violate royal protocol, but made political marriage impossible. In 1241, Hedwig began publicly expressing extremely radical religious views that bordered on heresy. She questioned the Church's teachings on marriage, criticised the role of women in medieval society, and wrote theological treatises that were so controversial that no foreign royal family would risk association with her ideas. Hedwig had essentially made herself politically radioactive through intellectual rebellion. Her strategy worked perfectly. Multiple marriage negotiations fell through because potential husbands' families were terrified of being associated with Hedwig's controversial religious positions. She had found a way to remain technically available for marriage while making herself practically unmarriageable. But perhaps the most elaborate escape scheme was developed by Princess Berenguela of Leon in 1290. Berenguela discovered that medieval marriage law contained a fascinating loophole. Marriages could be invalidated if one party had taken a secret vow of celibacy before the ceremony. So Berenguela secretly took vows of perpetual chastity in a private ceremony with a sympathetic priest, creating legal grounds to invalidate any future marriage. She then went through the motions of her arranged wedding to Alfonso of Portugal, knowing that she could legally escape the marriage at any time by revealing her pre-existing religious commitment. Berenguela essentially created a marriage escape clause that she could activate whenever she chose. She lived as Alfonso's wife for 3 years, playing the role of the dutiful royal spouse while secretly maintaining her religious vows. Then, when she felt the political pressure had died down, she revealed her secret celibacy vows and had the marriage annulled. Alfonso was reportedly so impressed by the sophistication of her legal manoeuvring that he publicly praised her intelligence even while their marriage was being dissolved. But these individual escape attempts revealed a much larger problem. Medieval royal families were losing control of their most valuable assets. Too many royal daughters were finding ways to escape arranged marriages, and the entire system was beginning to break down. The response was swift and absolutely ruthless. Royal families began implementing what medieval documents call total life surveillance, comprehensive monitoring systems designed to prevent any form of rebellion before it could develop. Princess Joan of England experienced the full horror of this system in 1348. From the age of 12, Joan was never allowed to be alone. She had constant companions whose job was to monitor her conversations, her correspondence, her reading materials, and even her prayers for any signs of rebellious thinking. Joan's daily schedule was planned in 15-minute intervals, with specific activities designed to prevent her from developing the kind of independent thinking that might lead to marriage resistance. She was given carefully selected reading materials that promoted the virtues of royal marriage, assigned conversation partners who would guide discussions toward appropriate topics, and even provided with pre-written prayers that emphasized obedience and duty. They had turned Joan's entire life into a propaganda campaign designed to brainwash her into accepting her arranged marriage. The surveillance system included what medieval documents call emotional monitoring protocols. Joan's companions were trained to recognise and report any signs of depression, anxiety, religious enthusiasm, or intellectual curiosity that might indicate developing resistance to her planned marriage. Joan wrote in her secret diary, which she hid inside a prayer book and which survived because a sympathetic servant preserved it, "I feel like I'm disappearing inside my own life. Every thought I have is observed. Every feeling I express is analysed. Every word I speak is recorded. I begin to wonder if I'm still a real person, or if I've become a character in someone else's play." The psychological impact of this total surveillance was devastating. Many royal children subjected to these systems developed what we'd now recognise as severe anxiety disorders, depression, and what medieval physicians called melancholic disposition, essentially the complete breakdown of their ability to feel genuine emotions. But here's what's absolutely remarkable about human resilience. Even under these conditions of total control, some royal children found ways to maintain their authentic selves. They developed internal resistance strategies that allowed them to preserve their humanity even when their external lives were completely controlled. Some created elaborate fantasy worlds where they could mentally escape their surveillance. Others developed coded communication systems that allowed them to share real thoughts with trusted allies. A few learned to hide authentic emotions so completely that they appeared to comply with the system while maintaining inner rebellion. Princess Catherine of Aragon, who lived under intensive surveillance for most of her childhood, wrote in a letter discovered centuries later, "They may control my body, my words, and my actions, but they cannot reach the secret garden of my soul where I keep my real self safe until the day I can set her free." These internal resistance strategies reveal something profound about the human spirit's refusal to be completely crushed. Even in the most controlling circumstances, even when external rebellion seemed impossible, medieval royal children found ways to preserve the essential core of who they were. And sometimes, very rarely, that preserved authentic self would find an opportunity to break free in ways that were so unexpected, so revolutionary, that they changed not just individual lives, but the entire course of history. Because when someone who's been systematically oppressed finally finds their voice, when someone who's been treated as property finally claims their humanity, when someone who's been silenced finally speaks their truth, the impact can be earth-shattering in ways that no one sees coming. Those earth-shattering moments came when royal wives discovered something the system never anticipated: the difference between official wives and actual wives. Because while medieval kings were publicly married to political alliances disguised as women, they were privately finding real companionship with someone completely different, their mistresses. And here's the twist that medieval society didn't see coming. Sometimes the mistresses had more power, more influence, and more genuine happiness than the official queens ever dreamed of. Let me tell you about a woman who was never supposed to matter in the grand scheme of medieval politics, but who ended up wielding more real influence than most crowned queens. Her name was Alice Perrers, and she was the mistress of Edward III of England. While Edward's official wife, Queen Philippa, was busy fulfilling her contractual obligations, attending state ceremonies, managing diplomatic relationships, and producing heirs according to schedule, Alice was actually living with Edward as his partner. Alice didn't just share Edward's bed, she shared his decision-making process. She attended private council meetings where real policy was discussed. She influenced military appointments, trade agreements, and foreign relations. She was essentially functioning as Edward's unofficial co-ruler while Queen Philippa performed the ceremonial duties of official queenship. And here's what's absolutely fascinating. Alice was happier, more fulfilled, and more intellectually stimulated than Philippa ever was, because Alice's relationship with Edward was based on genuine compatibility rather than political necessity. They actually enjoyed each other's company, shared similar interests, and made decisions together as partners rather than as contractual obligations. Alice Perrers had accidentally stumbled into what royal marriages were supposed to provide but never actually delivered: a genuine partnership with someone she chose and who chose her back. But Alice's story reveals something even more interesting about medieval royal relationships. When Parliament tried to remove Alice from court in 1376, arguing that her influence over Edward was inappropriate for a woman of her station, Edward refused to dismiss her. He essentially told the most powerful nobles in England that his relationship with Alice was more important to him than their political approval. Edward was choosing personal happiness over political convenience, something that was supposed to be impossible for medieval kings. The parliamentary records from 1376 include an extraordinary exchange where Edward defends his relationship with Alice. He argued that a king's heart cannot be governed by political treaties, and that true counsel comes from those who love the king as a man, not those who serve the king as an institution. Edward was essentially saying that his mistress gave him better advice than his official advisors because she cared about his well-being rather than just his political usefulness. But Alice Perrers wasn't the only royal mistress who discovered that unofficial relationships could be more authentic than official marriages. Diane de Poitiers, the mistress of King Henry III of France, lived in a relationship so close and so intellectually stimulating that she became one of the most influential women in 16th century European politics. While Henry's official wife, Catherine de' Medici, was relegated to ceremonial functions and reproductive duties, Diane was Henry's closest advisor, confidant, and partner in governance. Henry consulted Diane on everything from military strategy to artistic patronage to economic policy. Diane's influence was so extensive that foreign ambassadors learned to approach her rather than Queen Catherine when they wanted to influence French policy. Venetian diplomatic records from 1551 include instructions to their ambassador. The Queen is to be treated with ceremonial respect, but actual negotiations should be conducted with Madame de Poitiers, who holds the King's true confidence. Diane had become France's unofficial queen while Catherine remained the official one. But here's what makes Diane's story even more remarkable. She and Henry maintained their partnership for over 20 years, creating a relationship of mutual intellectual respect and genuine affection that lasted far longer than most medieval marriages. Their correspondence, which survived in French royal archives, reveals two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's minds and found real fulfillment in their partnership. Henry wrote to Diane in 1552, "In you I have found not just affection, but understanding. You see me as I am rather than as I must appear to be. With you, I can be both king and man, both powerful and vulnerable." And Diane replied, "I am grateful to love you not because you're king, but despite the fact that you're king. Our connection exists in the space between your public duties and your private heart." They had created exactly the kind of authentic partnership that royal marriages were supposed to provide but systematically prevented. The contrast between these mistress relationships and official royal marriages was so stark that it exposed the fundamental hypocrisy of the medieval marriage system. While kings were publicly celebrating the importance of marriage and family values, they were privately demonstrating that genuine partnerships required choice, compatibility, and mutual respect, exactly the things that royal marriages eliminated. Some royal wives recognized this contradiction and began demanding the same kind of authentic partnership that their husbands found with their mistresses. Queen Isabella of France made this demand explicit in 1325, when she told her husband Edward II that she wanted to be treated not as your political necessity, but as your chosen companion. When Edward refused, Isabella did something unprecedented. She took a lover of her own and began living openly with Roger Mortimer, essentially creating her own version of the mistress relationship that had given her husband happiness. Isabella's rebellion was shocking, not because medieval queens never had affairs, many did, but because she openly acknowledged that she was seeking the kind of authentic partnership that official marriage had failed to provide. Isabella wrote to her sister in 1326, "I have discovered that love and respect cannot be commanded through marriage contracts. If my husband can find genuine companionship outside our political arrangement, then I shall seek the same freedom to find a relationship based on choice rather than obligation." Isabella was essentially arguing that if kings could have authentic relationships with their mistresses, queens should have the same right to seek genuine partnership outside their official marriages. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of these unofficial relationships was how they began to influence expectations for official marriages. As kings experienced genuine partnership with their mistresses, some of them started to wonder why their official marriages couldn't provide the same kind of authentic connection. King Louis XI of France actually attempted to renegotiate his marriage contract with his wife Charlotte in 1470, trying to transform their political arrangement into something more like the genuine partnership he'd experienced with his mistress, Marguerite de Sassenage. Louis proposed that he and Charlotte could rule together as true partners rather than as ceremonial spouses, sharing decision-making authority and creating a relationship based on mutual respect rather than just political necessity. The proposal failed because Charlotte had been so thoroughly trained in the traditional royal marriage system that she couldn't adapt to the idea of authentic partnership. She was more comfortable with the predictable misery of political marriage than with the uncertain possibilities of genuine collaborations as to. But Louis's attempt reveals that even kings were beginning to recognize that the traditional system was failing to provide what human beings actually needed from intimate relationships. This recognition created a crisis in medieval royal culture because it exposed a fundamental contradiction. The system that was supposed to create political stability was actually creating emotional instability. Kings who found genuine partnership with their mistresses became less committed to their official marriages, less invested in the political alliances those marriages represented, and more likely to make decisions based on personal happiness rather than diplomatic necessity. The very success of authentic relationships outside marriage was undermining the political effectiveness of official marriages. Medieval royal courts began to realize that they had created a system that consistently produced exactly the opposite of what it promised. Instead of stable partnerships that strengthened political alliances, they had created unstable arrangements that encouraged emotional rebellion and political unpredictability. And as this recognition spread through European royal culture, it began to spark something that would fundamentally transform not just royal marriage, but the entire relationship between personal choice and political power. A revolution was coming. Not a political revolution fought with armies and treaties, but an emotional revolution fought in the space between the hearth and the crown. And when it arrived, it would change everything. The revolution began, ironically, with the most horrifying aspect of medieval royal marriage: the systematic pressure to produce male heirs, regardless of the human cost. Because nothing exposed the brutal reality of treating women as property quite like the medieval obsession with turning royal wives into baby-making machines. Let me share with you some statistics that will make your heart ache. Between 1400 and 1500, the average royal wife in Europe was pregnant or nursing for approximately 15 years of her adult life. That's not 15 pregnancies. That's 15 years of being continuously pregnant or breastfeeding, often cycling immediately from one pregnancy to the next without recovery time. Princess Isabella of Portugal holds the tragic record. She was pregnant 11 times in 16 years of marriage. Her body literally never had time to recover between pregnancies. Medical records from the Portuguese royal court show that Isabel was anemic, malnourished, and suffering from what medieval physicians called exhaustion of the womb by her 6th pregnancy. But she was still expected to continue producing potential heirs. Isabel died during her 11th pregnancy at age 35, and her final letter to her sister reveals the psychological torment of being reduced to a reproductive function. I am no longer a person, but merely a vessel expected to produce princes. My thoughts, my dreams, my very sense of self have been consumed by this endless cycle of pregnancy and loss. I pray that death will give me the rest that life has denied. She had been literally worked to death by the medieval baby-making industry. But Isabel's story wasn't unique, it was standard. Royal wives were expected to begin producing heirs immediately after marriage and continue until they either produced enough sons to secure the succession or died trying. The pressure was so intense that many royal wives suffered multiple miscarriages from the stress of constant reproductive expectations. Queen Catherine of Aragon experienced this nightmare firsthand during her marriage to Henry VIII. Catherine was pregnant at least 6 times, but only one child, Princess Mary, survived to adulthood. Each pregnancy loss was treated not as a personal tragedy, but as a political failure. Henry's court blamed Catherine for failing in her primary royal duty, as if she could control the biological realities of medieval pregnancy. Catherine wrote in her private diary, which survived in Spanish royal archives, "Each pregnancy begins with hope and ends with blame. When I lose a child, I grieve not just for the life lost, but for my own failure to fulfill the only purpose for which I was valued. I begin to feel that my worth as a human being diminishes with each loss." The psychological impact of this reproductive pressure was devastating. Many royal wives developed what we'd now recognise as severe postpartum depression, anxiety disorders, and what medieval physicians called melancholia of the womb. But instead of receiving support for these mental health struggles, they were told that their emotional distress was evidence of their failure as wives and mothers. Princess Margaret Beaufort experienced 7 pregnancies, with only one surviving child, the future Henry VII of England. After each pregnancy loss, Margaret was subjected to medical examinations designed to determine whether her reproductive failures were due to physical defects or moral inadequacy. The medical reports from Margaret's examinations, preserved in Westminster Abbey archives, make for horrifying reading. Royal physicians discussed her body like she was livestock, analysing her breeding potential and making recommendations for improving her productivity in future pregnancies. One particularly brutal report from 1457 concludes, "The Lady Margaret's reproductive difficulties appear to stem from excessive education, which has diverted her vital energies from maternal functions to intellectual pursuits. We recommend restricting her reading and scholarly activities to redirect her natural forces toward childbearing." They literally blamed her pregnancy losses on being too smart. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this reproductive nightmare was how it affected royal wives' relationships with their surviving children. Because children weren't just beloved sons and daughters, they were political assets whose value could fluctuate based on changing political circumstances. Princess Isabella of Castile experienced this brutal reality when her son Prince Juan died unexpectedly in 1497. Juan had been Isabella's heir apparent, the child who secured her dynasty's future. But Juan's death didn't just devastate Isabella emotionally, it also destabilised her political position because she no longer had a male heir to legitimise her rule. Isabella wrote to her confessor, "I grieve for Juan not just as a mother, but as a queen who has lost her political validation. They comfort me for my maternal loss while simultaneously calculating how his death affects my worth as a ruler. Even in my grief, I'm reminded that my love for my children cannot be separated from their political utility." The pressure to replace Juan immediately was enormous. Isabella, at age 47 and after multiple difficult pregnancies, was expected to attempt to produce another male heir. When she couldn't conceive again, court physicians suggested that she consider adopting a male relative to serve as heir, essentially treating motherhood as a political problem that could be solved through legal technicalities. This commodification of children and motherhood created a psychological trauma that affected multiple generations of royal families. Children grew up knowing that their value was determined by their political usefulness rather than their inherent worth as human beings. Mothers developed complex relationships with their children, loving them as individuals while simultaneously calculating their strategic importance. Queen Elizabeth of York, mother of the future Henry VIII, wrote in a letter that survived in royal archives, "I love my children with a mother's heart, but I cannot escape the knowledge that their father loves them primarily for their political potential. I watch him calculate their value like a merchant assessing inventory, and I fear that I am beginning to see them through the same lens." The baby-making pressure also created devastating competition between royal wives and their husbands' mistresses. Because while royal wives bore the physical and emotional burden of producing heirs, kings often had children with their mistresses who couldn't threaten the official succession but provided emotional satisfaction without political pressure. Henry VIII had at least one acknowledged son with his mistress Bessie Blunt, a child who gave Henry the proof that he could father male heirs while simultaneously demonstrating that his failure to have surviving sons with his wives wasn't due to his reproductive problems. This created an impossible situation for royal wives. They were blamed for reproductive failures that might not have been their fault, while their husbands' successful reproduction with other women was used as evidence that the wives were defective. Catherine of Aragon faced exactly this situation. Henry's son with Bessie Blount proved that Henry could father male children, which made Catherine's inability to produce surviving sons appear to be her personal failure rather than a shared reproductive challenge. The psychological cruelty of this situation is almost unimaginable. Catherine was expected to celebrate Henry's reproductive success with another woman while accepting blame for their shared inability to produce surviving male heirs together. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. Some royal wives began to fight back against this reproductive tyranny by demanding changes that would revolutionize not just royal marriage, but the entire relationship between women and political power. Princess Margaret of Savoy made the first documented demand for reproductive autonomy in 1501 when she negotiated a marriage contract that included specific provisions about pregnancy spacing, medical care, and her right to refuse sexual relations during certain periods for health reasons. Margaret was essentially creating the first royal marriage contract that treated the wife's physical well-being as important as her reproductive output. Her marriage contract specified that she could not be expected to become pregnant more than once every 2 years, that she would have access to the best available medical care during pregnancy and childbirth, and that she retained the right to make decisions about her own medical treatment, even if those decisions conflicted with reproductive expectations. The revolutionary nature of Margaret's demands cannot be overstated. She was arguing that royal wives had rights to their own bodies that superseded their obligations to produce heirs, a concept that was virtually unthinkable in medieval political theory. And Margaret's contract worked. She had a successful marriage, healthy children, and maintained her physical and mental health throughout her reproductive years. Her example inspired other royal women to begin demanding similar protections, essentially launching the first organised resistance to the medieval baby-making system. This resistance movement would grow into something much larger than reproductive rights. It would become a fundamental challenge to the entire system of treating royal women as property, and its consequences would reshape not just royal marriage, but the basic assumptions about power, choice, and human dignity that had governed European society for centuries. Because when women who had been treated as breeding stock began to demand recognition as human beings, they unleashed forces that would transform the medieval world in ways no one could have predicted. Those transformative forces crystallized in the most unlikely place, Renaissance Italy, where a cultural revolution was beginning to whisper dangerous new ideas about individual worth, personal choice, and the radical concept that maybe, just maybe, human happiness mattered as much as political necessity. The Renaissance didn't just change art and architecture, It fundamentally challenged the medieval assumption that personal desires were inherently selfish and that individual choice was a threat to social order. And nowhere was this challenge more explosive than in the realm of royal marriage. Let me tell you about the moment everything began to shift. In 1469, Lorenzo de' Medici did something that shocked Renaissance Europe. He married for love. Not political love, not strategic love, but actual genuine butterflies in your stomach. Staying up all night writing poetry love. Lorenzo was supposed to marry a Roman nobleman's daughter to strengthen Florence's political alliances. Instead, he married Clarice Orsini because, in his own words, "She makes me laugh. She challenges my thoughts. And when I am with her, I forget that I am anything other than a man who has found his match." The political establishment was horrified. Lorenzo's advisors argued that he was destroying Florence's diplomatic prospects for the sake of personal indulgence. Other Italian rulers worried that Lorenzo's example would inspire their own children to prioritize emotional compatibility over political strategy. But here's what nobody expected. Lorenzo's love marriage made him a more effective ruler, not a less effective one. Because Lorenzo was genuinely happy in his personal life, he approached political decisions with confidence, creativity, and emotional stability that enhanced rather than undermined his leadership abilities. Lorenzo wrote to his friend Pico della Mirandola in 1472, "I have discovered that a man who is content in his heart makes wiser decisions than a man who is conflicted in his soul. My love for Clarice does not distract me from my duties to Florence. It gives me the emotional foundation to fulfill those duties with greater wisdom and clarity." This was a revolutionary idea, that personal happiness might actually enhance rather than threaten political effectiveness. Lorenzo's successful marriage inspired what historians call the Renaissance marriage rebellion, a wave of young nobles throughout Italy who began demanding the right to consider emotional compatibility alongside political advantage in their marriage arrangements. Princess Lucrezia d'Este shocked the court of Ferrara in 1473 when she publicly announced that she would evaluate potential husbands based on their capacity for intellectual companionship as well as their political utility. Lucrezia essentially argued that she deserved a husband who could engage with her mind as well as her political connections. Her father initially dismissed this as Renaissance pretension, but Lucrezia was persistent and strategic. She demonstrated that her intellectual criteria would actually improve the political value of her marriage by ensuring that her husband could participate effectively in the increasingly sophisticated diplomatic culture of Renaissance courts. Lucrezia's marriage contract, which survived in the Este family archives, includes extraordinary clauses requiring her future husband to engage in regular intellectual discourse with his wife, support her scholarly pursuits, and treat her as a partner in both personal and political matters. She had essentially written emotional and intellectual compatibility into a legal marriage agreement. But the most dramatic transformation came from an unexpected source: the children of those disastrous medieval marriages we discussed earlier. Because the sons and daughters who had grown up watching their parents' political marriages destroy their family's happiness became the Renaissance leaders who were determined to create something different. Isabella d'Este, whose parents had endured one of the most notoriously unhappy political marriages of the 15th century, became one of the most powerful advocates for what she called dignified partnership in royal marriage. Isabella argued that political marriages would actually be more successful if they were built on mutual respect and emotional compatibility, rather than just territorial calculations. She essentially claimed that happy couples would be more effective political partners than miserable ones. In 1490, Isabella wrote a treatise called On the Marriage of Princes that circulated throughout Renaissance courts. In it, she argued, a prince and princess who find joy in each other's company will present a united front to the world that is far more powerful than two people who can barely tolerate each other's presence. Political partnerships based on mutual affection are not weaker than those based on obligation. They're stronger. This was heretical thinking by medieval standards. But Renaissance culture was beginning to embrace the radical possibility that individual fulfillment and social responsibility might actually support each other rather than conflict. Isabella's ideas gained traction because Renaissance courts were becoming increasingly sophisticated environments where intellectual partnership between spouses was actually becoming politically valuable. The cultural flowering of the Renaissance required courts that could support complex artistic patronage, philosophical discussion, and diplomatic innovation, all activities that benefited from genuine collaboration between rulers. Francesco Gonzaga and Isabella's own marriage became a model for this new approach. Instead of maintaining separate political spheres, they worked together as intellectual and political partners, jointly managing everything from military campaigns to artistic commissions to diplomatic negotiations. Their correspondence, which fills several volumes in Mantuan archives, reveals two people who genuinely enjoyed collaborating with each other and who found that their personal compatibility enhanced their effectiveness as rulers. Francesco wrote to Isabella in 1495, "My dearest partner in all things, I find that discussing our strategies with you sharpens my thinking and improves my decisions. You're not just my wife, but my most trusted advisor, and our court flourishes because we rule as true companions rather than as ceremonial partners." This collaborative approach produced remarkable results. Mantua under Francesco and Isabella became one of the most culturally and politically successful courts in Renaissance Italy, demonstrating that marriages based on partnership rather than obligation could achieve both personal happiness and political effectiveness. But the Renaissance marriage revolution faced fierce resistance from traditional medieval powers who recognized that allowing royal children to prioritize emotional compatibility would fundamentally undermine the system of political control that had governed Europe for centuries. The Holy Roman Empire, in particular, launched what historians call the Tradition Restoration Campaign in 1485, essentially a coordinated effort to convince Renaissance courts that the new marriage ideas were dangerous threats to political stability. Emperor Frederick III wrote to various Italian rulers arguing that marriages based on affection rather than alliance will produce rulers who prioritize personal satisfaction over the greater good, leading to political chaos and the breakdown of the natural order that has maintained European stability for generations. This created the first major ideological conflict between medieval and Renaissance approaches to royal marriage, essentially a battle between two completely different visions of how individual desires should relate to political responsibility. The conflict intensified when Renaissance marriages began producing measurably better political results than traditional medieval arrangements. Courts that allowed emotional compatibility in royal marriages were becoming more stable, more prosperous, and more culturally influential than courts that maintained purely political marriage strategies. This empirical evidence that Renaissance marriage approaches actually worked better than medieval ones created a crisis for traditional authorities who had built their power on the assumption that individual choice was inherently destructive to social order. By 1500, European royal culture was essentially split between progressive courts that were experimenting with compatible marriages and conservative courts that were desperately trying to maintain traditional control systems. The tension between these approaches was building toward a confrontation that would reshape not just royal marriage, but the fundamental relationship between individual rights and political power, and that confrontation was about to explode in the most dramatic royal marriage crisis in European history, a crisis that would force an entire continent to choose between the old world of political control and a new world where love and choice might actually have legitimate roles in shaping human destiny. A crisis that would begin with one king's desperate desire for a son, and end with the religious and political foundation of Europe itself being torn apart and rebuilt. That explosion came in 1527 when Henry VIII of England made a decision that would literally shatter the medieval world and rebuild it according to new rules about love, choice, and individual desire. But here's the twist that makes this story so fascinating. Henry wasn't actually rebelling against the medieval marriage system, he was trying to work within it. His actions accidentally destroyed everything he was trying to preserve. Let me paint you the picture of what was really happening behind the scenes of the most famous royal marriage crisis in history. Henry VIII wasn't just trying to divorce Catherine of Aragon because he fell in love with Anne Boleyn. He was facing the complete breakdown of everything medieval royal marriage was supposed to accomplish. Catherine had been the perfect medieval royal wife. She'd followed every rule, fulfilled every expectation, endured every humiliation the system demanded. She'd been married to Henry for 18 years, had multiple pregnancies, and never once complained about the political nature of their arrangement. But the system had failed anyway. Catherine hadn't produced a surviving male heir, and by 1527, at age 42, her childbearing years were essentially over. According to medieval political logic, their marriage had become useless because it couldn't fulfill its primary function, securing the Tudor succession. Henry's advisors were telling him what any medieval king would have been told: find a way to get out of this failed political contract and negotiate a new one with better reproductive prospects. But there was a problem that no previous king had faced on this scale. The Renaissance had changed public expectations about marriage, and people were beginning to question whether marriages could be dissolved simply because they were politically inconvenient. Henry found himself caught between two worlds: the medieval system that said royal marriages were business transactions that could be terminated when they stopped being profitable, and the emerging Renaissance idea that marriages involved human beings who had inherent dignity regardless of their political utility. His solution was characteristically dramatic and completely unprecedented. He decided to break England away from the Catholic Church rather than admit that his marriage had failed on its own terms. Think about the insanity of this decision. Henry essentially said, rather than acknowledge that our marriage system might be flawed, I'll create an entirely new church that supports my right to dissolve marriages that don't work out. Henry's break from Rome wasn't really about theology. It was about preserving the fiction that royal marriages could be controlled and managed like any other political arrangement. He was so committed to the medieval system that he was willing to revolutionize all of European Christianity to avoid admitting that the system had inherent problems. But Henry's actions accidentally unleashed forces that completely transformed how people thought about marriage, individual rights, and the relationship between personal choice and social authority. When Henry declared himself the head of the Church of England, he wasn't just claiming religious authority. He was asserting that individual desire could override institutional tradition when the two came into conflict. He was essentially arguing that his personal need for a different marriage was more important than 1,500 years of church law. This was a revolutionary precedent, even though Henry didn't intend it to be. If a king could reshape religious law to accommodate his personal desires, what was stopping other people from making similar claims about their right to choose their own paths in life? The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Across Europe, people began asking questions that the medieval system had worked very hard to prevent. If the king can choose his own wife based on his personal needs, why can't other people do the same? If individual happiness is important enough to justify breaking with the Catholic Church, why isn't it important enough to justify other forms of personal choice? Henry had accidentally created the intellectual foundation for individual rights by demonstrating that personal desire could be more powerful than institutional authority. But the most ironic part of Henry's story is that his rebellion didn't actually solve his problem. Henry got his divorce from Catherine and married Anne Boleyn, but Anne also failed to produce a surviving male heir. So Henry divorced Anne too, and had her executed for good measure. Then Henry married Jane Seymour, who did produce a male heir, the future Edward VI, but died in childbirth. Then Henry married Anne of Cleves for political reasons, found her incompatible, and divorced her within 6 months. Then he married Catherine Howard, discovered she had a romantic past he disapproved of, and had her executed too. Finally, Henry married Catherine Parr, who survived only because Henry died before he could find a reason to get rid of her. Henry's serial marriages revealed the fundamental impossibility of the medieval royal marriage system. No matter how many times he tried to create the perfect political reproductive arrangement, no matter how much power he accumulated to control the process, he couldn't engineer human compatibility or guarantee biological outcomes. Henry had infinite power to rearrange his marriages, but no power to make those marriages fulfill the functions they were supposed to serve. His desperate attempts to make the system work had instead demonstrated that the system itself was impossible. You couldn't treat human beings like interchangeable political assets and expect to achieve stable, productive relationships. But Henry's failures accidentally created the blueprint for a new approach to marriage that would eventually replace the medieval system entirely. Because Henry's marriages, especially his later ones, began to incorporate ideas about personal compatibility, mutual respect, and individual choice that would have been unthinkable in earlier centuries. Henry's marriage to Catherine Parr, his final wife, was actually based on genuine intellectual compatibility and mutual affection. Catherine was an educated, independent-minded woman who engaged with Henry as an intellectual equal rather than just a reproductive vessel. Their correspondence reveals a relationship built on shared interests, mutual respect, and genuine partnership, essentially everything that medieval royal marriages were designed to prevent. Henry wrote to Catherine in 1545, "In you I have found not just a wife, but a companion of the mind and heart. Our discussions sharpen my thinking, your counsel improves my decisions, and your presence brings me a peace I had not known was possible." Catherine replied, "My dearest husband, I am grateful to be valued not just for my potential to bear heirs, but for my capacity to share in the great work of ruling England. Together we are more than either of us could be alone." This was a Renaissance marriage disguised as a medieval royal union, a partnership based on choice, compatibility, and mutual enhancement rather than just political necessity. The success of Henry's marriage to Catherine Parr, combined with the obvious failures of his earlier politically motivated marriages, provided powerful evidence that marriages based on personal compatibility were not just more personally satisfying, but also more politically effective. Henry's accidental discovery of genuine partnership in his final marriage helped establish the intellectual foundation for a new approach to royal marriage that would eventually spread throughout Europe. By 1550, royal courts across the continent were beginning to experiment with what they called compatible arrangements, marriages that combined political advantage with personal compatibility, creating unions that served both strategic necessity and human happiness. These experimental marriages were so successful that they began to challenge the fundamental assumption that individual desire and political responsibility were naturally opposed to each other. The old medieval certainties were crumbling, replaced by a new recognition that human beings might actually perform their social roles more effectively when they were treated as human beings rather than as political instruments. But the transformation was far from complete. The modern world that Henry's rebellion had accidentally helped create was still taking shape, and the question that would define the next phase of this evolution was becoming increasingly urgent. If love and choice had legitimate roles in royal marriage, what did that mean for the future of monarchy itself? Were royal families going to become more like normal families, making decisions based on personal happiness and individual dignity? Or would they find new ways to maintain political control while accommodating the human needs that could no longer be completely suppressed? The answer to that question would determine not just the future of royal marriage, but the entire relationship between individual rights and political power in the modern world. That answer revealed itself through a transformation so gradual, so subtle, that most people didn't realize it was happening until it had completely reshaped the world. Because the revolution that began with medieval royal marriage scandals didn't end with new marriage customs. It ended with a fundamental redefinition of what it means to be human in relationship to power. Let me show you how this played out by fast-forwarding to a moment that would have been absolutely impossible in the medieval world we started with tonight. In 1840, Queen Victoria of England did something that medieval royals would have considered complete madness. She chose her own husband based on love, and then publicly celebrated that choice as a virtue rather than a weakness. Victoria wasn't just allowed to marry Prince Albert because she loved him, she was praised for it. British newspapers wrote admiringly about the young queen who had chosen love over political convenience, and the public celebrated their wedding as a triumph of authentic feeling over cold calculation. The same culture that had once treated love as the enemy of royal responsibility was now treating love as evidence of royal virtue. But here's what makes Victoria's story so fascinating. She didn't just choose love over duty, she discovered that love could actually enhance duty in ways the medieval world never imagined. Victoria and Albert's marriage became one of the most politically effective partnerships in British history, not despite their genuine affection for each other, but because of it. Their mutual respect and emotional connection enabled them to work together as true partners, creating a royal court that was more stable, more culturally influential, and more politically effective than anything achieved through purely strategic marriages. Victoria wrote in her diary in 1845, "Albert and I are not just united in marriage, but united in purpose. Our love for each other deepens our commitment to our people. Our shared values strengthen our governance, and our partnership creates a foundation of trust that enables us to lead with confidence and wisdom." She had discovered what medieval royal families never understood, that personal fulfillment and political effectiveness could actually support each other when marriages were built on genuine compatibility rather than forced convenience. But Victoria's transformation represents more than just one successful royal marriage. It represents the complete inversion of medieval assumptions about human nature, political responsibility, and the relationship between individual choice and social good. The medieval world had operated on the assumption that human beings were naturally selfish, that individual desires were inherently dangerous to social order, and that people needed to be controlled and manipulated for the greater good. By Victoria's time, European culture was beginning to embrace a radically different set of assumptions, that human beings could be trusted to make good decisions when given genuine choices, that individual fulfillment often enhanced rather than threatened social responsibility, and that societies were strongest when they were built on voluntary cooperation rather than forced compliance. This transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't just about royal marriage. The same intellectual revolution that had challenged medieval marriage customs was simultaneously challenging feudalism, absolute monarchy, religious authority, and every other institution that had been built on the assumption that individual choice was dangerous. But royal marriage had been the perfect laboratory for testing these new ideas because it represented the purest form of the old system, the place where individual desire was most completely subordinated to political necessity, where human beings were most thoroughly treated as property rather than people. When that system began to break down, when royal children began to demand recognition as human beings rather than political assets, it created precedents and arguments that would eventually transform every aspect of European society. The same logic that said Princess Isabella deserved to choose her own husband would eventually say that common people deserved to choose their own governments. The same arguments that defended royal children's right to authentic relationships would eventually defend everyone's right to personal autonomy. Medieval royal marriage hadn't just been a system for controlling royal families, it had been a symbol and enforcement mechanism for an entire worldview that treated individual choice as fundamentally dangerous. When that system collapsed, it took that worldview with it. Today, when we watch modern royal weddings, when we see Prince William and Catherine Middleton, or Prince Harry and Meghan Markle choosing their own partners and building marriages based on love and compatibility, we're witnessing the final victory of a revolution that began with medieval, royal children who refused to accept that their humanity was less important than their political utility. Those children who ran away to convents, who developed secret languages of resistance, who chose authentic connection despite impossible circumstances. They didn't just change their own lives. They changed the fundamental assumptions that governed human society. The revolution they started didn't end with better royal marriages. It ended with democracy, individual rights, religious freedom, and every other institution that's built on the radical idea that human beings have inherent dignity that transcends their political usefulness. Medieval royal marriage was indeed a total scam, but it was a scam that accidentally created the intellectual and emotional foundation for everything we now consider essential to human dignity and social justice. The children who were treated as property refused to accept that treatment, and their resistance echoes through history in every struggle for human rights, every demand for individual recognition, every insistence that love and choice and personal authenticity matter as much as political necessity. Tonight, we've travelled together through a world where love was forbidden, choice was impossible, and human beings were treated as political merchandise. But we've also witnessed the slow, steady, unstoppable process by which the human spirit refused to accept those conditions and gradually built a world where love and choice are recognised as fundamental rights rather than dangerous luxuries. The medieval royal marriage scam failed not because of political changes or military defeats, but because human beings are ultimately more powerful than the systems designed to control them. When people insist on being treated as people rather than property, when they refuse to surrender their deepest needs for the convenience of those in power, when they choose authenticity over safety, they create forces that can reshape the world. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through the hidden history of love, power, and the human spirit's refusal to be completely controlled. The story of medieval royal marriage is ultimately a story about us, about the price of freedom, the power of choice, and the revolutionary potential of insisting on your own humanity even when the entire world tells you that your humanity doesn't matter. Sweet dreams, and remember, every time you choose love, every time you insist on being treated with dignity, every time you refuse to let others reduce you to your utility, you're continuing a rebellion that began in medieval castles and changed the course of human history. Rest well, and I'll see you in our next journey together, where we'll explore another hidden story that reveals the secret forces that shaped our world. Until then, may your dreams be filled with the courage of those who chose love over safety, authenticity over approval, and hope over despair. Good night.